The radio operator adjusted his headset. He scanned the frequency. He checked the squelch. He checked it again. The transmission was clean. No static, no interference. The voice on the other end was speaking English, clearly, confidently, without hesitation. And Sergeant First Class Dennis Morrow of the U.S. Army Signals Intelligence Unit, Bien Hoa Province, 1968, could not extract a single piece of actionable intelligence from what he was hearing. Not because the signal was weak, not because the encryption was sophisticated, not because the enemy had developed some new technology that outpaced American capabilities. Because an Australian soldier had just announced over open radio in plain English with complete calm that it was last drinks. Morrow wrote in his field report that night, "Subject transmission appears to reference a social occasion. Unable to determine operational significance. Flagging for further analysis." He flagged 43 transmissions that week. 43. Every single one of them made perfect sense to the Australians who sent them. Every single one of them was impenetrable to everyone else. This is that story. To understand what happened in Phuoc Tuy Province between 1966 and 1971, you need to understand something that nobody planned, nobody authorized, nobody designed, and nobody could have predicted.
The Australian task force that deployed to Vietnam brought with them, in addition to their weapons and their training and their considerable tactical skill, a communication system of extraordinary effectiveness. It had no classification level, it required no hardware, it could not be captured, copied, or compromised. It lived entirely inside the heads of men who had grown up in a specific country, in a specific culture, and who talked about everything, including war, the way they talked about everything else. They talked like Australians. And that, it turned out, was enough. The Australians arrived in Vietnam with a reputation. They were disciplined soldiers, aggressive in the field, tactically innovative, and deeply uncomfortable with what they considered American overcomplicated procedure. American units operated under strict communications protocols. Call signs rotated on schedule. Encrypted brevity codes governed tactical transmissions. Everything was documented, standardized, and designed to minimize the intelligence value of any intercepted message. The Australians looked at this system with the particular expression Australians reserve for things they find both impressive and completely unnecessary. They had their own system. Their system was talk normally. Talk the way you talked at the pub, at the footy, at the races. Talk the way you talk to your mates on a Saturday afternoon in Bankstown or Toowoomba or Fremantle. Use the words you grew up with. Use the references you absorbed without thinking. Use the humour that required no explanation because everyone around you already understood it. Because everyone around you had been shaped by the same culture, the same landscape, the same particular way of seeing the world. Talk Australian. Transmit Australian. Let the enemy figure it out. The enemy could not figure it out. Neither could the Americans. The first incident involving what would eventually be called the last drinks transmission occurred on the 14th of March 1967. An Australian Special Air Service Regiment patrol, 4 men operating deep in Phuoc Tuy Province, had established surveillance of a significant NVA logistics route. The patrol had been in position for 36 hours. They had catalogued vehicle movements, identified supply caches, and confirmed the presence of a command element that Australian intelligence had been seeking for 6 weeks. The patrol commander, a staff sergeant whose operational record remains partially classified, radioed his findings to the Task Force Operations Centre at Nui Dat. The transmission lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds.
It contained precise grid references, accurate enemy strength estimates, and a clear tactical recommendation. It was transmitted entirely in plain language, entirely in English, entirely without encryption.
It was also transmitted with what the staff sergeant later described as the usual sort of chat. The usual sort of chat included, at the conclusion of the transmission, the phrase, "Reckon it's last drinks for these blokes. Over." The American liaison officer monitoring the Joint Operations Net wrote in his log, "Australian element reports contact area. Message partially unclear. Reference to social drinking occasion at end of transmission. Possible morale issue. No further action taken." No further action taken. There was a very great deal of action taken. The staff sergeant had not been reporting a social occasion. He had not been expressing a desire for alcohol. He had not been making a casual observation about pub culture. He had been communicating with complete precision to every Australian in the operations centre exactly what he intended to do to the NVA command element he had just located. Last drinks. In Australian culture, last drinks is the call made at closing time in a pub. It is the announcement that this is the final opportunity. After this, there is nothing more. The bar is closed. The night is over. Whatever you wanted, you should have gotten earlier, because you are not getting it now. Last drinks is the end. It is finality. It is the point after which no further options exist. In the context of an Australian soldier radioing about an enemy position, last drinks meant one specific thing with absolute clarity to every Australian who heard it. These men were not going to be permitted to leave. The operation that followed was clean, professional, and completely successful. The NVA command element was neutralised. The logistics route was disrupted. The task force achieved its objective without friendly casualties. The after-action report was thorough and accurate. Every detail was recorded correctly, except the phrase that had authorized the entire approach. In the American liaison report, the after-action section noted, "Australian element engaged and destroyed target. Pre-engagement transmission included unidentified social reference. Significance unclear." Significance unclear. Sergeant First Class Morrow, now 3 months into his assignment monitoring Australian communications, had by this point developed a personal notebook. It was not an official document. It was a small green notebook he had purchased in Vung Tau on a 4-day leave pass. In it, he wrote down every Australian phrase that had defeated him. The notebook had 40 pages. By March 1967, it was half full. The entry for last drinks read, "Appears to signal something significant. Australians seem to understand immediately. Tone is decisive. Possibly related to pub closing time in Australia? Cannot confirm operational meaning. Cross-reference needed." The cross-reference never came. Not because Morrow did not pursue it, because by the time he had developed a working hypothesis about what last drinks might mean, the Australians had already used it in 17 separate transmissions and had, with the casual creativity that defined their approach to language, begun modifying it. Last rounds. The bar's shut. Locking up. Time, gentlemen. Each phrase drawn from the same cultural well. Each one immediately legible to any Australian. Each one completely opaque to anyone consulting a dictionary or a translation manual. You cannot look up a concept in a phrasebook if the concept exists only in the lived experience of a specific culture. Morrow knew this. He wrote it in his green notebook. These phrases are not codes, they are memories. You cannot decode a memory you do not share. He was 26 years old, and he had arrived at a conclusion that would take the US Military Assistance Command Vietnam's formal linguistic analysis team another 14 months and 400 pages to reach. The second category of Australian communications that disrupted enemy signals intelligence came not from combat terminology, but from sport, specifically from cricket. More specifically, from the particular and deeply Australian relationship with cricket that treated the game not as a pastime, but as a philosophical framework through which all of human experience could be understood, interpreted, and communicated. Non-cricket nations find this difficult to comprehend. Americans find it essentially incomprehensible. The Viet Cong found it operationally maddening. The phrase that caused the most documented confusion was 3 words long. The pitch is sticky. To understand why this phrase defeated North Vietnamese signals intelligence analysts for a period of approximately 8 months in 1967 and 1968, you need to understand what it means. Then you need to understand what the NVA thought it meant. The distance between those two things is the distance between a cricket pitch after overnight rain and a kitchen in which something has gone wrong with the sugar. In cricket, a sticky pitch, also called a sticky wicket in its more famous form, is a playing surface that has been affected by moisture in a specific way. When a cricket pitch dries after rain under sun, it becomes unpredictable. The ball behaves strangely. Deliveries that should bounce low bounce high. Deliveries that should travel straight deviate unexpectedly. Batting on a sticky pitch is extraordinarily difficult. The normal rules do not apply. What you expect to happen does not happen. The ground itself has become an active adversary. An Australian soldier saying the pitch is sticky was not commenting on the weather. He was not discussing a game. He was communicating to every Australian listening a precise tactical assessment. The ground situation had changed in unpredictable ways. The enemy was behaving unexpectedly. The normal tactical assumptions did not apply, and anyone operating in that area needed to abandon their standard approach and adapt immediately to conditions that could not be anticipated. 5 words. Complete tactical intelligence. Delivered in plain language over an unencrypted radio frequency, understood instantly by every Australian in the operations network. Impenetrable to everyone else. The NVA Signals Intelligence Team assigned to monitor Australian Task Force communications had, by late 1967, produced a working glossary of what they believed were coded agricultural and culinary terms in Australian military communications. The glossary was discovered after the war in captured intelligence files. It is a remarkable document. Under the heading Food and Cooking-related transmissions, the NVA analysts had catalogued "pitch is sticky" alongside what they believed were related phrases. Good length delivery, he's playing a straight bat, caught on a full toss, and the bowler's getting some swing. Their working hypothesis was that Australian units were using bakery and cooking terminology as a substitution code for tactical situations. They had assigned meanings accordingly. Pitch is sticky, their glossary stated, probably indicates that a supply situation has become complicated, possibly referring to logistics issues with a sticky or adhesive material such as fuel or lubricant. The Australian soldiers were not discussing fuel, they were discussing cricket. But the NVA, having no framework for understanding cricket as a universal interpretive lens, had done what any reasonable analyst would do when encountering an unfamiliar system. They had found the nearest available reference and applied it. The nearest available reference was food. The result was that the NVA intelligence picture of Australian Task Force operations in Phuoc Tuy Province for approximately 8 months included a persistent, unexplained anomaly. Australian units appeared to be conducting complex logistical operations involving some form of adhesive or sticky material in quantities that did not correspond to any known military application. Reports were filed. Requests for clarification were sent up the chain. Senior NVA intelligence officers reviewed the data and concluded that the Australians might be conducting some form of chemical operation,
or possibly constructing field fortifications using an unusual bonding agent. They were playing cricket. Not literally, they were discussing cricket.
In every transmission that referenced pitch conditions, batting strategies, bowling variations, and fielding positions, Australian soldiers and officers were conducting precise, accurate, operationally sophisticated tactical communications. They were discussing ground conditions, enemy positions, engagement approaches, unit dispositions, and threat assessments. Every term had an exact meaning. Every meaning was instantly understood by the receiver. The language was not decorative. It was functional. It worked perfectly. It worked perfectly because it was invisible. Private First Class Stephen Caruso, the American radio operator who had watched the Australians sabotage the 212-page Vietnamese vernacular manual, said something in a post-war interview that captured the cricket problem precisely. I remember sitting in the signals tent and hearing this long conversation about some bloke's bowling action and whether the outfield was playing slow. And I genuinely could not tell whether they were talking about a cricket match or a military operation. Turns out it was a military operation. The outfield was a free fire zone. The bloke with the bowling action was an NVA mortar crew. They sorted it out. I still don't understand cricket. He paused. I'm not sure the NVA did either. The NVA did not. This was confirmed not by American analysis, but by the captured glossary, which devoted 7 pages to what its authors called the cricket problem, using that exact phrase, apparently in genuine frustration. The 7 pages contained careful analysis of individual terms, attempted contextual mappings, and a final summary paragraph that stated, in the measured language of professional intelligence work, that cricket-related transmissions remained unresolved, and that resources devoted to their analysis had not produced actionable results. Resources devoted to their analysis. An enemy intelligence service assigned dedicated resources to understanding cricket, and failed. Because cricket, like Australian slang, is not a system you can analyse from outside. It is a culture. You either grew up in it, or you did not. You either instinctively understand that the pitch is sticky means danger, complexity, the abandonment of standard approaches, or you do not. No amount of analysis substitutes for the years of Saturday afternoons watching the game, arguing about the game, using the game as the primary metaphor through which you understood everything else. The Australians had been doing that for their entire lives. The NVA had been doing it for 0 minutes. The gap was unbridgeable. Warrant Officer Kevin Doyle, whose post-war work on Australian communications security touched on this period, wrote in his memoir that the cricket transmissions represented the purest example of what he called cultural depth encryption. The security, Doyle wrote, does not come from the complexity of the code. It comes from the depth of the culture required to understand it. You can teach someone a code in an afternoon. You cannot teach someone a culture in a lifetime. A code is a system. A culture is a history. You can break a system. You cannot break a history. You cannot break a history. The third incident, and in many ways the most operationally significant, centred on a phrase that was in one sense not a phrase at all. It was a sentence. A complete, grammatically correct, unambiguous English sentence. 4 words. A subject, a verb, a possessive pronoun, and a noun. The sentence could not have been simpler. It required no slang knowledge. It contained no rhyming code. It made no reference to cricket, horse racing, pub culture, or any of the other culturally specific domains that had defeated American and enemy analysts throughout the war. The sentence was, "The ashes are ours." And it sent the North Vietnamese army retreating from a position they had held for 11 days in the mistaken belief that they had already been defeated. To understand how 4 simple English words accomplish this, you need to understand the ashes. Not the concept of ashes in general, the ashes. The specific, capitalised, deeply sacred Australian institution that has governed the cricket rivalry between Australia and England since 1882. When Australia defeated England on English soil that year, a mock obituary was published in a British newspaper, declaring that English cricket had died and that the body would be cremated and the ashes taken to Australia. The two nations have been playing Test cricket for those ashes, a small urn of genuinely uncertain contents, ever since. To an Australian, the ashes are not a sports trophy. They are a cultural touchstone. They are proof of something. They are the embodiment of a competitive national identity. To say the ashes are ours is to make a statement about victory that goes beyond the score of a game. It means we have won what matters. We have taken the thing that defines the contest. It is over. We have it. It is done. The phrase entered Australian military communications in Vietnam not through any official process, but through the same mechanism that generated all Australian slang. It happened, it worked, it spread. The specific transmission that changed the course of an 11-day engagement occurred on the 7th of August 1968 at 0340 hours. An SASR element had been operating in support of a larger task force operation targeting an NVA regimental headquarters that had established itself in the dense jungle northwest of Xuyen Mok. The operation had been ongoing for 11 days. The NVA position was well defended, well supplied, and commanded by officers who had demonstrated both tactical skill and the capacity to absorb pressure without withdrawing. At 0340 hours, an Australian patrol element, having achieved a specific operational objective that allowed a particular tactical interpretation to be made, radioed a single transmission to the operations centre. The ashes are ours. Over. In the operations centre at Nui Dat, every Australian present understood immediately. The patrol had achieved its objective. A specific outcome had been reached. The phase of the operation that the patrol commander had been tasked with completing was complete. The next phase could begin. The message was precise, unambiguous, and instantly actionable. In the NVA Signals Intelligence Network, the transmission was intercepted within 40 seconds. It was transcribed, translated, and analysed within 6 minutes. The translation was accurate. The ashes are ours. 4 words, present tense, declarative, no ambiguity in the English. The analysis took longer. The NVA intelligence officer who reviewed the transmission had been briefed on Australian communications difficulties. He had the partial glossary. He had the bakery hypothesis. He had 17 months of accumulated frustration with Australian radio traffic. He had also, unlike many of his colleagues, a reasonable command of English. He understood the words. He could not understand the meaning. He did what any trained analyst does when encountering an unfamiliar cultural reference. He consulted available materials. His available materials included captured Australian documents, previous intelligence reports, and a working knowledge of Allied operations in the province. He found no reference to ashes in any operational context. Then he made a connection. Australian forces had been engaged in a sustained operation for 11 days. The operation had been intense. There had been significant contact. The word ashes, in his understanding of English and of warfare, had one obvious military meaning. Ashes were what remained after something had been destroyed. If the Australians were transmitting that ashes were theirs, the most logical interpretation was that they had destroyed something significant. The regimental headquarters, the command element, the entire position. The operation was over. The Australians had won.
There was nothing left to defend. He reported accordingly. He was wrong in every specific detail, and almost right in the general assessment, which made it worse. The SASR element had achieved its specific tasked objective, which was significant but not conclusive. The operation was not over. The regimental headquarters had not been destroyed. The position was not reduced to ashes. The phrase referred to cricket. The NVA intelligence officer had never watched cricket in his life and had no way of knowing this. His report went up the chain within 40 minutes. It reached regimental command within 2 hours. At 0620 hours, the NVA commander, receiving intelligence that his headquarters had been compromised and largely destroyed by an Australian operation that he could not locate or confirm, made the calculation that all competent commanders make when presented with intelligence that their position is untenable. He ordered a withdrawal. The withdrawal was orderly and professional. The NVA were good soldiers. They moved with discipline. They took their equipment. They were gone from a position they had successfully defended for 11 days by the time the main Australian task force element moved to assault it at 0800 hours. They found an abandoned headquarters, intact, undestroyed, still operational if anyone had been there to operate it. The after-action assessment noted with considerable confusion that the NVA had withdrawn from a defensible position without apparent military reason. Several explanations were considered: poor intelligence on the NVA side, logistical pressure, orders from a higher command with a different strategic picture. The correct explanation, that 4 words about a cricket trophy had been mistranslated as confirmation of a military defeat, did not appear in any official document. It appeared eventually in a memoir. The SASR patrol commander, whose name is withheld at his own request in the published account, wrote 30 years later that he had always found the result slightly absurd. "We sent one message," he wrote, 4 words, and they left. We walked into a headquarters they'd been holding for nearly a fortnight, and it was empty. Cups of tea still warm. I've thought about it a lot over the years. They had us. They were dug in, they knew the ground, they had the numbers. And they left because of cricket. He paused in the telling, then added, "I suppose there are worse things to win a war with." There are worse things to win a war with. Captain Howard Nichols, the American Signals Intelligence Officer, whose post-war study of Allied communication security produced the most comprehensive assessment of the Australian phenomenon, devoted an entire chapter to what he called the 3 phrases. Last drinks, the pitch is sticky, the ashes are ours. He had interviewed Australian veterans, reviewed captured enemy documents, and cross-referenced American liaison reports. His analysis was precise, and his conclusion was uncomfortable. These 3 phrases, Nichols wrote, illustrate a principle that formal communications security doctrine has never successfully incorporated. The principle is this: the most effective security is the security that the enemy does not recognize as security. Enigma was a security system. The enemy knew it was a security system and devoted resources to defeating it. Australian Slang was not a security system. The enemy encountered it, could not categorize it, and allocated resources to analyzing a problem that was, by its nature, unanalysable. The result was that Australian communications consumed enemy intelligence resources disproportionate to any other Allied element in theatre, while requiring 0 investment in equipment, training, or maintenance on the Australian side. 0 investment. The Americans spent tens of millions of dollars on SIG-Arbor encryption machines. The British maintained the infrastructure of Bletchley Park. The Germans built the Enigma network. Every major military power in the 20th century invested enormous resources in the problem of secure communication. The Australians watched the footy and talked about cricket. and their communications were, by every measurable standard, more secure. Private Arthur Rawlings, the New Guinea veteran who had described his experience in an earlier war, was still alive in 1971 when the Australian task force withdrew from Vietnam. He was interviewed by a journalist writing about the war's end. The journalist asked whether he had followed the Vietnam deployment. Rawlings said he had followed it closely. The journalist asked whether anything surprised him about how the Australians had performed. Rawlings thought for a moment. "Same thing as always," he said. "Nobody could understand us." He smiled. "We weren't even trying to be confusing. That's the funny part. We were just talking." He was 81 years old. He had seen 2 wars across 2 generations. He had watched the same phenomenon repeat itself with the same result, and he had arrived at the same conclusion that Lieutenant Holt had arrived at in 1942, that Morrow had arrived at in 1967, that every analyst who had ever sat across from an Australian radio transcript had eventually been forced to accept. You either grew up there, or you did not. You cannot learn it. You cannot fake it. You cannot replicate it. It is not a system. It is not a code. It is not a cipher. It is a way of being that carries, as an incidental feature, the quality of being completely impenetrable to anyone who did not share the same 20 years of growing up in the same country, under the same sky, watching the same game, and drinking in the same pubs. Last drinks, the Australians might have said, to the entire enterprise of enemy signals intelligence directed at their transmissions. And they would have been right. Because for the intelligence services of 3 separate nations across 3 separate conflicts, when it came to understanding how Australians talked to each other, the bar was very much closed. It had been closed the whole time. They just hadn't known it. The green notebook that Sergeant First Class Dennis Morrow had purchased in Vung Tau did not survive the war intact. It was water-damaged in a monsoon season incident that Morrow described in later years as one of the minor tragedies of his professional life. Not because the notebook contained classified material, it did not, but because it contained 3 years of careful, honest, increasingly bewildered observation of a phenomenon that no official document had captured with the same personal clarity. What survived was photocopied before the damage became total. 41 pages, Morrow had filled every one. The entries became progressively more philosophical as the months passed. Early entries were analytical. Subject used unknown term, probable meaning unclear. Later entries were something closer to personal reckoning. The entry dated the 19th of September 1968, 6 weeks after the Ashes transmission, read as follows. Spent the afternoon with Corporal Hutchins from the SASR liaison element. Asked him directly to explain the last drinks phrase. He laughed for approximately 40 seconds before answering. Then he explained it. Then he asked if I understood. I said yes. He said I didn't, not really. He said understanding the words and understanding the meaning were 2 different things, that you had to feel it. I asked what that meant. He laughed again. I think he was right. I think I will never feel it. I think I will never feel it. That sentence sat in a photocopied notebook in Morrow's desk drawer for 30 years before he showed it to anyone. He showed it to Nichols during the post-war research interviews. Nichols read it twice. Then he put it down and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "That's the whole report right there. That's the 400 pages in one sentence." Nichols was not wrong. The formal study that Nichols eventually produced ran to 387 pages, not counting appendices. It drew on materials from 6 separate archives in 4 countries. It interviewed 42 veterans from Australian, American, and South Vietnamese forces. It reviewed captured enemy documents and cross-referenced them against Australian after-action reports and American liaison logs. It was a serious piece of work, conducted by a serious officer who had devoted 2 years of his post-service career to understanding something that had bothered him for the entire length of his Vietnam deployment. Its central finding was this: the Australian military's natural communication style created an inadvertent signals intelligence barrier of greater practical effectiveness than any formally designed encryption system deployed by any Allied force in the Vietnam theatre. Inadvertent. That word was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, and Nichols knew it. He spent an entire chapter justifying it. Because the obvious objection to calling it inadvertent was that by 1968, the Australians knew what they were doing. They knew the Americans couldn't follow them. They knew the NVA had given up trying. They knew the cricket glossary existed. They had found copies of it. They had, in the tradition established by their predecessors in World War II, immediately begun using the catalogued phrases in the most confusing ways possible, specifically to defeat any analytical system that relied on the glossary. So was it still inadvertent? Nichols argued yes. And his argument was subtle and worth following carefully. The Australians, he wrote, did not change how they communicated in response to knowing they were impenetrable. They communicated exactly as they had always communicated. The security was not a strategy. The security was a byproduct. What changed when the Australians became aware of the situation was not their communication, but their enjoyment of it. They had always talked this way. Now they knew it was funny. The amusement was new. The language was not. And the language was the thing that mattered. He drew an analogy that became the most quoted passage of the report. A chameleon, he wrote, does not decide to become invisible. It simply exists, and invisibility is what existence looks like from the outside. The Australian soldier did not decide to speak in an unbreakable code. He simply spoke, and an unbreakable code is what speech looked like from the outside. The chameleon does not understand camouflage as a system. It understands being a chameleon. The Australian soldier did not understand cultural depth encryption as a doctrine. He understood being Australian. The security was not in the knowing. It was in the being. The security was not in the knowing. It was in the being. That line circulated quietly through certain corners of the American signals intelligence community for years afterward. It appeared, without attribution, in at least 3 separate internal training documents from the 1970s and 1980s. Someone at Fort Meade, Maryland, thought it was important enough to quote without crediting its source, which meant someone at Fort Meade was thinking about it, which meant the Americans, even after the war, even after all the reports and all the failures and all the carefully documented evidence, were still trying to understand something that Nichols had already told them could not be understood from the outside. You cannot learn to be Australian. You cannot study your way into it. You cannot simulate it. You cannot construct it deliberately and then deploy it, because the moment you try to construct it deliberately, you have already destroyed the quality that makes it work. Warrant Officer Kevin Doyle, who had reached the same conclusion independently through a completely different analytical process, called it the observer effect problem. In physics, the observer effect describes how the act of measuring something changes the thing being measured. In Australian Communications Security, Doyle wrote, the equivalent principle is this. The moment you try to manage the language deliberately, you change it into something manageable. And something manageable is something breakable.
The security existed in direct proportion to the unconsciousness of its application. Observe it too carefully, and you destroy it. Try to control it, and it dies. It lived only in the space where nobody was thinking about it, where soldiers were simply talking to each other the way they had always talked, where the language was alive and moving and completely unaware of its own significance. Completely unaware of its own significance. That unawareness was the armour, not the words themselves, not the cricket references or the pub phrases, or the rhyming slang or the inversions. The unawareness. The fact that every Australian who transmitted the pitch is sticky, or the ashes are ours, or last drinks, was not thinking about signal security. He was thinking about the situation on the ground. He was communicating information to his mates. He was doing what humans do when they share a culture. He was using the language of that culture to move information from one mind to another as efficiently as possible. Efficiency was the goal. Security was the accident. And the accident was irreproducible by design. The NVA signals intelligence apparatus did not surrender immediately or gracefully. They were professionals. They had resources. They had motivation. And they had, by late 1968, developed a specific project devoted entirely to Australian communications. The project had a designation in the captured files that translates roughly as Special Analysis Group, Australian Dialect Problem. The group consisted of 7 analysts. All 7 had English language training. 3 had studied at institutions with access to Western cultural materials. 1 had spent 18 months in Paris and had significant exposure to Anglophone culture through French academic circles. They were, by any reasonable measure, as well equipped to tackle the problem as any non-Australian could reasonably be. They worked for 9 months. Their final report was 38 pages long. It contained 112 specific phrase analyses. Of those 112, 47 were assessed as probably correct, meaning the analysts believed they had identified the likely meaning with reasonable confidence. 29 were assessed as possibly correct, meaning the direction of the meaning was identified, but the specific application remained unclear. 36 were assessed as unknown, meaning 9 months of work by 7 trained professionals had produced no interpretable result. And the 47 that were assessed as probably correct were, as the post-war review of the files established, wrong in 31 cases. Probably correct had meant probably wrong more than 60% of the time. The report's conclusion section contained a passage that became something of an intelligence legend after it was translated and circulated in American signals analysis circles following the war. The passage read, in full translation, "The dialect problem is not amenable to conventional cryptanalytic methods because it does not function as a cryptographic system. It functions as a cultural system. The distinction is absolute. A cryptographic system can be attacked mathematically. A cultural system can only be attacked culturally. To attack it culturally requires cultural membership. Cultural membership cannot be acquired through analysis. It is acquired through life. We do not have the life. We cannot acquire it. We recommend this problem be classified as permanently unresolved, and that resources currently allocated to it be redirected to more productive targets." Permanently unresolved. That was the official NVA intelligence assessment of the Australian language problem. Not very difficult, not highly complex, not beyond current capabilities, but requiring additional resources. Permanently unresolved. a classification that does not appear in NVA intelligence documents with reference to any other Allied communication system used in the Vietnam conflict. The Americans broke Japanese codes at Midway. The British broke Enigma at Bletchley. The NVA broke American operational security regularly enough that it materially affected the conduct of the war. Australian pub phrases defeated everyone. There is a particular soldier whose story threads through the Vietnam phase of this history in a way that deserves individual attention. His name was Corporal Brian Hutchkins.
He was from a small town in rural Tasmania. He had grown up on a sheep property 40 kilometres from the nearest town of any size. His father had been a shearer's cook. His mother had been a schoolteacher for 30 years, which had given Hutchkins a facility with language that expressed itself not in formal clarity, but in an almost supernatural density of regional vernacular. Hutchkins spoke Tasmanian, not Australian, Tasmanian. The distinction matters. Australian slang varied by region, with the same logic that any living language varies by region. The same root system, but different branches, different specific expressions, different particular references. Tasmanian English in the mid-20th century had its own specific character. It drew on convict-era vocabulary that had died out on the mainland. It incorporated terms from the Huon Valley apple industry, the timber trade, the specific topography of a large island with significant geographic isolation. It was Australian English plus 40 years of additional evolution in a contained environment. Hutchkins, when he talked on the radio, produced something that defeated Australians. Not all Australians. His section knew him. His platoon knew him. His company had developed, over 18 months of working with him, a reasonable facility with his particular variant. But Australians from elsewhere, hearing Hutchkins for the first time on the radio, required a beat of processing time before comprehension arrived.
Sometimes 2 beats. Sometimes the comprehension did not arrive at all, and someone had to clarify. The Americans had no beats. They had nothing. The NVA analysts, who had struggled for 9 months with standard Australian English, encountered a Hutchkins transmission in late October 1968 and apparently concluded they were dealing with a completely different language. The captured files contain a notation that reads, in translation, "New dialect element identified, possibly regional, possibly unit-specific, possibly new encoding system. Analysis suspended pending further data." Analysis was never resumed because the further data was more Hutchkins, and more Hutchkins produced the same result. There is a record from a debrief conducted after the war in which an American liaison officer described attending an operational briefing at which Hutchkins served as radio operator. The briefing was conducted by an Australian major. The radio traffic that accompanied it was handled by Hutchkins. The American officer reported that he had understood the major clearly and the radio operator not at all. At one point, he said, the major had stopped the briefing to have Hutchkins repeat a transmission. Then the major had translated the transmission into, I quote, "what I think was supposed to be regular Australian, and I still needed one of the other Australians to tell me what it meant." It was 3 layers of translation before I had a sentence in English. 3 layers of translation. From English to English to English to English. Hutchkins was aware of his effect on people and found it straightforwardly amusing. A post-war interview conducted in 1974, when Hutchkins was working as a fencing contractor in the Huon Valley, produced this exchange. Interviewer: "Were you aware during the war that your communications were difficult to understand?" Hutchkins: "Oh yeah, the Yanks used to look at me funny." Interviewer: "Did that concern you?" Hutchkins: "Nah, blokes I was with knew what I meant." Interviewer: "And the enemy?" Hutchkins: "Mate." A pause of several seconds followed, according to the interview transcript.
Hutchkins. Mate, they had no hope. They had no hope. The interview transcript notes that Hutchkins laughed at this point for what is described as a considerable period. Then he offered the interviewer a cup of tea and they discussed sheep prices for 20 minutes. The particular genius of Hutchkins, if genius is the right word for something that was entirely natural and completely unplanned, was that he represented the far end of a spectrum that ran through every Australian soldier in Vietnam. Every Australian in that conflict operated somewhere on the unintelligibility scale. Some were moderately impenetrable. Some were significantly impenetrable. Hutchkins was at the extreme end, where impenetrability became something close to a unique acoustic phenomenon. But the scale itself was the point.
The enemy did not know where any individual transmission would fall on that scale. Standard analytical approaches to communication security assume that once you understand the system, you can apply that understanding consistently. Break the Enigma key, and you can read every message encoded with that key. Identify the call sign rotation, and you can track every unit using that rotation. Find the pattern, and you can exploit the pattern. Australian communications had no consistent pattern to find. They varied by individual, by unit, by region of origin, by time of day, by operational context, by the specific relationship between the soldiers involved, by a dozen other variables that no external analysis could map, because the variables were not variables at all. They were people. Human beings shaped by specific lives, specific places, specific memories that had no correspondence to anything in any intelligence database in Hanoi or Washington or anywhere else. You cannot crack the key when the key is a person. Doyle wrote that in his memoir and then sat with it for what he described as a long afternoon before deciding it was the clearest thing he had ever written about the subject. You cannot crack the key when the key is a person. By 1969, the operational picture in Phuoc Tuy province had developed a quality that Australian veterans remembered with a particular mixture of pride and disbelief. The task force operated with a communications freedom that no other Allied element in Vietnam enjoyed. American units maintained strict communications discipline because they knew the enemy was listening and the enemy could understand them. British advisory elements used formal protocols for the same reason. South Vietnamese units had their own vulnerabilities. The Australians talked. They talked about cricket. They talked about the footy. They used pub closing time as a military operational code, and they used a cricket trophy as a tactical communications tool, and they described ground conditions with agricultural metaphors that had been absorbed from a landscape 12,000 kilometres away, a landscape so specific in its character that nobody who had not grown up in it could have generated those metaphors naturally. And if you cannot generate it naturally, you cannot fake it. And if you cannot fake it, you cannot use it. And if you cannot use it, you cannot understand it. The NVA knew the Australians were talking. They intercepted every word. They transcribed with accuracy. They translated with care. They analysed with dedication. And they got nothing. 9 months of dedicated analysis, 112 phrase studies, 7 trained professionals, permanently unresolved. Meanwhile, an Australian corporal from rural Tasmania was on the radio telling his mates that the sticky pitch needed sorting before smoko, and they all knew exactly what he meant. And the NVA were filing another baffled report, and Hutchkins was already on to the next transmission. The war ended. The Australians came home. The green notebook survived in a filing cabinet in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, for 11 years before Morrow retrieved it during a move and brought it home. He kept it in a desk drawer. His children found it after he died in 2003 and could not read it.
Not because the handwriting was difficult, though it was, because the entries were in a private shorthand that Morrow had developed over 3 years of trying to describe something that resisted description. His daughter, in a short piece she wrote for a Veterans Association newsletter in 2004, described finding the notebook and the experience of trying to read it. The entries were mostly abbreviations, she wrote, and question marks. A lot of question marks. And in the last few pages, toward the end, the question marks stopped. He seemed to have given up on questions. The last entry just said, "They know something I don't know." Not about the war, about how to be somewhere together. About how to be somewhere together. That is what the language was in the end. Not a cipher, not a code, not a security system, not a communications protocol. It was the sound of people being somewhere together.
The sound of a shared history made audible. The sound of growing up in the same country, watching the same game, drinking in the same pubs, being shaped by the same landscape, and the same humour, and the same particular way of facing the world that had evolved over generations of Australians being Australians. The enemy heard it. The Americans heard it. They all heard the same thing. Words in English that produced no usable intelligence. The Australians heard something different. They heard home. And home, as it turned out, was the most effective security classification ever deployed in the field. Not secret, not top secret, not eyes only. Home. The classification that required no clearance to grant and no authority to revoke, because you either had it or you did not. You either grew up with it, or you arrived from outside and stood at the edge of it. And the edge was where the intelligence stopped and the silence began. Last drinks. The bar is closed. The ashes are ours. The pitch is sticky. And if you have to ask what any of that means, then you were never inside to begin with.